He was 12 years old when he found a photograph that would change everything hidden inside a shoebox under his foster mother's bed, and in that moment, staring at the faces of strangers who somehow looked exactly like him, he'd realized that everything he had been told about where he came from was a lie. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand why this discovery shattered his entire world, you need to know who Marcus really was and what he had already survived just to make it to that moment. Marcus grew up in the Riverside projects on the south side of Chicago, where the sounds of sirens and gunshots were as common as birds chirping in other neighborhoods, and where most kids his age had already seen things that would give grown adults nightmares for the rest of their lives. He had been in the foster system since he was 3 years old, passed from home to home like a piece of unwanted furniture, and by the time he landed with Miss Patterson when he was 9, he had learned not to unpack his bags completely, because he knew it was only a matter of time before he'd be moving again. Miss Patterson wasn't cruel, but she wasn't warm either, and she had 7 other foster kids in that cramped 3-bedroom apartment. So Marcus learned early that if he wanted to eat, he had to be fast, and if he wanted to survive, he had to be invisible. The other kids at school called him Ghosts, not because he was quiet, but because he seemed to fade into the background no matter where he was. Always watching, always listening, never quite belonging to any group or any place. He wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, all of them too small and faded from too many washes. And his shoes had holes in the soles that he covered with cardboard so Miss Patterson wouldn't have to spend money on new ones. Every morning he would walk 40 minutes to school because the bus route did come through their section of the projects, and every afternoon he would walk back, passing the same corner dealers and the same burned-out buildings and the same hopeless faces that had been there yesterday and would be there tomorrow. But Marcus had something that most kids in his situation didn't have, and that was a mind that worked like a machine, absorbing information and solving problems faster than anyone around him could understand. He taught himself to read when he was 4 by studying the labels on cereal boxers and street signs, and by the time he was in 6th grade, he was reading at a college level, devouring every book he could get his hands on from the public library, which became his sanctuary and his escape from the chaos of his daily life. His teachers noticed his gift. Of course they did. But in a school where half the kids didn't show up and the other half were just trying to survive until graduation, one smart kid didn't seem like a priority worth fighting for. There was one teacher, though, Mr. Chun, who taught math and who saw something in Marcus that nobody else had bothered to look for. He started giving Marcus extra assignments, harder problems that would challenge him, and Marcus would complete them overnight and come back the next day hungry for more. Mr. Chun told him that he had the potential to be something great, that his mind was a gift that could take him anywhere he wanted to go. But Marcus would just nod politely, because he had heard adults make promises before, and he knew that promises meant nothing when you are a black kid from the projects with no family and no future. The day Marcus found the photograph was a Saturday in October, cold and gray like most days in Chicago during that time of year. And Miss Patterson had taken the other kids to a church event that Marcus had pretended to be sick to avoid. He was alone in the apartment, which almost never happened, and he was bored. So he started exploring the places he normally couldn't go, opening drawers and closets just to see what was inside. That's when he found the shoebox under Miss Patterson's bed tucked away in the back, behind old shoes and storage bins, and something about the way it was hidden made him curious enough to pull it out and look inside. There were documents in that box, official-looking papers with state seals and signatures, and photographs, dozens of them of people Marcus had never seen before. But there was one photograph in particular that made his heart stop, a family portrait taken maybe 15 or 20 years ago, showing a young couple with 3 children. And the resemblance was so strong that Marcus felt like he was looking into a mirror that showed him what he could have been in a different life. The man in the photos had the same wide-set eyes and strong jaw that Marcus saw every time he looked at his own reflection. And the woman had the same deep dimples and high cheekbones. And the children, 2 boys and a girl, they all had that same look, that same unmistakable family signature. Marcus's hands were shaking as he turned the photograph over, and on the back, written in faded blue ink, were the names Jonathan, Patricia, Jonathan Jr., Michael, and Sarah Mitchell, with a date from 1998 and an address in a town Marcus had never heard of, called Willow Creek, somewhere downstate near Springfield. He sat there on the floor of Miss Patterson's bedroom for almost an hour, staring at those faces, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, trying to understand why a photograph of people who looked exactly like him would be hidden. Foster mother-ass belonging. And then it hit him. The possibility that had never occurred to him before because nobody had ever told him anything about where he came from. The possibility that these people weren't strangers at all, that they were his family, his real family, and that for some reason he didn't understand, he had been separated from them. The next few weeks were torture for Marcus because he couldn't stop thinking about that photograph and what it might mean. But he also couldn't ask Miss Patterson about it without revealing that he had been snooping through her private things. He spent hours at the library using the public computers to search for information about the Micha family, typing their names into search engines and scrolling through results that mostly led nowhere. He found a few social media profiles that might have been them, but the accounts were private or inactive. And he found an old newspaper article about a Jonathan Mitchell who had won some kind of community service award in Willow Creek back in 2005. But there were no photos and no other details that could confirm it was the same person. Marcus started having dreams about the family in the photograph. Vivid dreams where he was living in a real house with a yard and a dog, where there was always food in the refrigerator and someone waiting to ask him about his day, and he would wake up in his narrow bed in the crowded foster home feeling more alone than ever before. He began to withdraw even more than usual, spending his lunch periods in the library instead of the cafeteria, avoiding Mr. Chun's concerned questions about whether everything was okay at home. The truth was that nothing was okay, that Marcus felt like he was living a lie like the black kid everyone saw walking through those project hallways didn't actually exist, and the person he might have been was living somewhere else without him. It was Mr. Chun who finally broke through Marcus's isolation, pulling him aside after class one day in November and sitting him down for a conversation that Marcus had been trying to avoid. Mr. Chun didn't ask what was wrong. He just started talking about his own childhood, about how he had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 8 years old, and how he had spent years feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, not in America, where he was different, and not in Taiwan, which he barely remembered. He told Marcus that feeling lost was normal, that everyone goes through periods where they question who they are and where they fit in the world, but that the key was to remember that your past doesn't define your future, that you get to choose who you become regardless of where you started. And something about the way Mr. Chun said it, with such quiet certainty and such genuine care, made Marcus break down and tell him everything. He told him about the photograph, about the black family that looked like him with the same rich brown skin and features he saw in his own mirror, about the sleepless nights and the dreams and the feeling that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. Mr. Chun listened without interrupting, and when Marcus was finished, he said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. He said that truth was important, but that seeking it required courage, and that Marcus had to decide whether he was brave enough to face whatever answers he might find. That conversation gave Marcus the push he needed to confront Miss Pedersen, and one evening after dinner when the other kids were watching TV, he asked her if they could talk privately in her room. He could see the worry flash across her face, probably thinking he was about to tell her he wanted to move to a different home. But when he showed her the photograph and asked her directly who these people were and why she had their picture, her expression changed to something Marcus couldn't quite read, something between guilt and sadness and relief. She sat down heavily on her bed and motioned for Marcus to sit beside her, and then she told him a story that explained everything and nothing all at once. Miss Pedersen explained that the Mitchell family had been his biological family, that Jonathan and Patricia Mitchell had been his parents, and that he had 2 older brothers and an older sister who he had never known about. She told him that when he was 3 years old, his parents had died in a car accident on a winter night when black ice covered the highway, and that the extended family had made the devastating decision to split up the children because nobody could afford to take in all 4 kids at once. The oldest siblings, who were teenagers at the time, had been taken in by their grandmother in Willow Creek, but Marcus had been too young and the grandmother too old to handle a toddler, so he had been placed into the foster system with the understanding that it would be temporary, just until someone could get their life together enough to take him in. But temporary had turned into permanent because life had gotten in the way, because his grandmother had gotten sick and his siblings had grown up and moved on with their lives, and because the foster system had a way of making black children disappear into its bureaucracy where they were forgotten by everyone except the social workers who processed their paperwork. Miss Patterson, who was also a black woman from the South Side and understood what it meant to lose family to the system, had been given the photograph and some basic information when Marcus was first placed with her 2 years ago, told that there might be a possibility of reunification someday. But she had never pursued it because she assumed that if the family wanted contact, they would have reached out themselves. And she didn't want to disrupt their lives or Marcus's life by forcing a connection that maybe nobody wanted anymore. Marcus sat there absorbing this information, running his fingers over his tight coils of hair the way he always did when he was thinking hard, trying to process the fact that he had brothers and a sister who were alive somewhere, that he had been part of a real black family once before tragedy had torn them apart. He felt angry that nobody had told him sooner that he had spent years thinking he was completely alone in the world, when the truth was that he had siblings who might have been wondering about him the same way he was wondering about them. He felt scared about what it would mean to reach out to them after all this time, whether they would even remember the little brown-skinned toddler they had lost, or want to know the 12-year-old kid from the projects he had become. And most of all, he felt a desperate, overwhelming need to find them, to see their faces in person, to ask them 1,000 questions about their parents and his early childhood and why nobody had ever come back for him. Ms. Patterson helped Marcus track down his siblings, making phone calls to social services and old contacts until she finally got a current address for his grandmother's house in Willow Creek, where at least one of the siblings still lived. It took Marcus 3 weeks to work up the courage to write a letter because he didn't know what to say. How do you introduce yourself to a family that doesn't know you exist? How do you explain a lifetime of absence in a few paragraphs on paper? He wrote and rewrote that letter a dozen times, and finally, with Mr. Chun's help, editing it down to something simple and honest. He mailed it off and then spent the next 2 weeks in agony waiting for a response that might never come. The response came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December when Marcus was at school, and Miss Peterson called the principal's office to have him brought home immediately because there was someone there who wanted to meet him. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard during that walk home that he thought it might burst out of his chest, and when he opened the door to the apartment, There were 3 people sitting on the worn couch in the living room, 2 men and a woman, all of them with the same deep brown skin and strong features that Marcus saw every morning in his own reflection. His sister Sarah started crying the moment she saw him, her dark eyes filling with tears as she took in the sight of her baby brother, all grown up. And his brothers Jonathan Jr. and Michael just stood there frozen like they were seeing a ghost. And for a long moment nobody said anything because there were no words big enough to bridge the gap of 13 years. But then Sarah crossed the room and pulled Marcus into a hug that felt like coming home, her braids brushing against his face as she held him tight, and she kept saying over and over that she was sorry, that they had tried to find him, that they had never stopped thinking about him, that losing him had been the second worst thing that ever happened to them after losing their parents. His brothers joined the embrace, and Marcus could see his father's face in Jonathan Jr.'s strong jawline and his mother's smile in Michael's dimples, and Marcus, who had taught himself not to cry years ago because crying was weakness in the foster system, broke down completely and sobbed in a way he had allowed himself too since he was a little kid. They spent hours that afternoon just talking, sharing memories, and filling in the gaps of their separate lives, and Marcus learned that his siblings had searched for him multiple times over the years but kept hitting dead ends in the bureaucracy of child services, and that they had assumed he had been adopted by a loving family somewhere and was living a better life than they could have given him. The truth was more complicated than Marcus had imagined because his siblings had their own struggles and their own trauma from losing their parents and watching their family fall apart. Sarah had dropped out of college to take care of their grandmother until she passed away 4 years ago, and she was working 2 jobs just to keep the house and pay off medical bills, struggling with the same economic barriers that kept so many black families from building generational wealth. Jonathan Jr. had joined the military right after high school and had only recently come back to Willow Creek after finishing his service, carrying his own invisible wounds from everything he had seen and done overseas. And Michael had gotten into trouble with drugs for a few years after watching too many of his friends from the neighborhood get locked up or killed, but had been clean now for 18 months and was working in construction trying to rebuild his life. They weren't the perfect fantasy family that Marcus had imagined when he first found that photograph. They were real people with real problems and real pain, but they were his people, his blood, and they wanted him back. The legal process of getting Marcus out of foster care and into his sister's custody took 6 months of paperwork and court appearances, and home visits from social workers who had to verify that Sarah could provide a stable environment and Marcus could help. But notice how much harder they seemed to scrutinize everything compared to the white families he had seen breeze through the system. During that time, Marcus visited Willow Creek every other weekend, getting to know the siblings he had lost and the family history he had been denied, learning about the great-grandparents who had migrated from Mississippi during the Great Migration and the grandfather who had worked in the steel mills, and the traditions and struggles that made up his family's story. His brothers taught him things. Their father had taught them how to fix a car and throw a football and stand up for yourself without using your fists. And his sister told him stories about their mother, about her laugh and her cooking, and the way she used to sing gospel songs while she cleaned the house, and how she had always told them to be proud of who they were no matter what the world tried to tell them. They took Marcus to the cemetery where their parents were buried, and he finally got to say hello and goodbye to people he would never remember, but who had given him life and a legacy he was only beginning to understand. The day Marcus finally moved to Willow Creek permanently was the happiest and saddest day of his life. Happy because he was finally going home to his real family, but sad because he was leaving behind Miss Peterson, who had kept him safe even if she hadn't kept him informed, and Mr. Chun, who had believed in him when nobody else bothered to look. But both of them told him the same thing, that this was his chance to have the life he deserved, and that he should take it and never look back with regret. Marcus promised to make them proud. to use his gift and his second chance to become everything they believed he could be, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. 3 years later, Marcus graduated at the top of his high school class in Willow Creek and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University, becoming the first person in his family to go to college in 2 generations. And standing in the audience watching him accept his diploma were his sister and his brothers and the ghost of the boy he used to be, who never believed this moment was possible. He learned that family isn't just about blood or biology. It's about the people who show up for you and fight for you and refuse to let you disappear, especially in a system that was designed to make kids who look like him invisible. He learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living a lie. And most importantly, he learned that your beginning doesn't determine your ending, that every day is a chance to rewrite your story and reclaim the life you were always meant to live. Because sometimes the black kid from the projects doesn't just survive. Sometimes he finds his way home and discovers that he was never really lost, just waiting to be found.